Hello, everyone. So, as you know, coronavirus is a pretty big deal. Hopefully, I don't get censored right away here. Whoops, I shouldn't have said the COVID word. But bottom line is, this virus has killed millions of people worldwide, hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S., and so it's important to figure out where this came from so we can prevent it from happening again. Right? Unfortunately, for over a year, the media has been lying to us about the possibilities of where this may have come from. So now, if you search on Google or look anywhere in the news, they're talking about how the theory that it came from a lab studying coronavirus, bat coronavirus in Wuhan, China, that is a plausible theory now. Yet for over a year, the media has been describing this theory as false and saying that it was debunked with no evidence to support the debunking, which is not scientific in any way. In order to credibly say something is false and debunked, you need to have evidence to support it. Okay. So this is very, very concerning for a number of reasons. Not like I said, it's as serious. Millions of people have died, and also, if you've been watching my videos and you're up to date on how YouTube's algorithm works, well, they elevate corporate media because they call them authoritative sources, and they suppress everyone else in the process because we're not authoritative sources. But hello, what makes them authoritative sources? That's a logical fallacy. It's an appeal to authority. Authority gets it wrong, and in the case of the media, all the goddamn time. And this is a perfect example. And so let's go through some of these uh, some of these media fails that led us up to this point. Now, first, let me clarify. Let me say, so what they were saying in the beginning, they were saying that it originated in a seafood market in Wuhan. So they say that's plausible, offering no evidence as to why that's plausible, opposed to it coming from a virus lab, a virus research lab, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that's literally 2 miles away from the seafood market where they were studying coronavirus in bats at this lab, 2 miles away from the sea market. So it's plausible to say they were arguing that it was absolutely certain to have come from this seafood market, but not from, but it was absolutely insane. And you were a conspiracy theorist just to ask if it could have possibly perhaps come from the lab 2 miles away that was studying coronavirus. All right, let's look through these. The wonderful history, wonderful receipts collected by Drew Holden here. I added a couple. Um, so as he says, the idea that COVID-19 may have leaked from a lab in Wuhan, China, has gained mainstream traction of late. It can be easy to forget that a little over a year ago, the idea was derided as vile, senseless conspiracy theory. As a vile, senseless conspiracy theory. It's actually not that hard to it's not easy to forget that because we were propagating with that for over a year. We haven't forgotten that. All right, so here's some examples. Oh, here's one I added. BuzzFeed, of course, was drank the Kool-Aid, and they falsely claimed that the lab leak theory was definitely false. Quote, definitely false. In their article about hoaxes spreading about the coronavirus, they said that some have, quote, falsely claimed it came from a lab in Wuhan. Falsely claimed. So they're saying that you can't use the word false. The only way you can use the word false is definitively. So you could say, now if you were being fair and accurate, which the BuzzFeed and the rest of the media were not, is you'd say there's no evidence to support it came from the lab at that point in time, and the evidence is low to prove whether it came from the market or the lab. It's just low. There's little evidence at all to support any of it. And yet they'll only say that. So instead of saying there's no evidence to support the lab leak theory at the time, they say it's false, even though they could have just as easily explained that there's no evidence to support it came from the fish market, other than China said that's where it started. So our media, our American media, didn't feel the need to be like, hold on, maybe can we? So does China have any evidence to back this up? What is the evidence to back this up? They didn't bother with that. Pathetic, absolutely pathetic, and it's obviously because now you might be like, hold on, the government. I thought I thought the media is stenographers for the government. They just repeat what the government says. But this is the Chinese government. So why are they taking it from the Chinese government in this case, and not the U.S. government? So it's a weird situation. It's because they were anti-Trump. Okay, so it's entirely political, and that's problematic when you want when you're supposedly an authoritative source. That's problematic across the board, but especially problematic because all these social media algorithms, they favor these people as authoritative sources. They're not. All right. So Drew Holden goes on, explains. So Senator Tom Cotton said he took much of the initial heat for suggesting the lab leak theory as a possibility back in January. Here's what the New York Times had to say about this, quote, fringe theory that, quote, lacks evidence and which, quote, scientists have dismissed. Now, if they were being fair, you would say, again, that what they were pushing as the definitive origin of COVID, the market, that also lacked evidence, but that's not how they put it. They say one lacks evidence. They don't mention that the one that they're saying is true also lacks evidence. All right, and so what were their headlines? Senator Tom Cotton repeats fringe theory of coronavirus origins. In an interview on Fox News, Senator Tom Cotton raised the unsubstantiated rumor that the new coronavirus originated in a high-security biochemical lab in China. The theory lacks evidence and has been dismissed by scientists. Well, you could say that same shit about the other theory, about the theory in the fish lab. Or not the fish lab, the fish market rather than the coronavirus research lab. In another piece in 2020, New York Times concluded that most agencies remain skeptical and, quote, scientists are dismissive of the lab leak theory. Unfortunately, appears that was certainly true, but not to their credit. Yet another story continues to describe the idea as a conspiracy theory. Here you go. New York Times and Twitter. They said Trump officials pushed spy agencies to hunt for evidence to back an unproven theory. The coronavirus started in a lab in China. Most agencies remain skeptical. Scientists are dismissive of the theory. Some analysts worry pressure could distort assessments. Okay. Now, it's true, a lot of scientists dismissed the theory. Now, a group of scientists, sorry, not just scientists, but a group of people at the WHO were put together to figure out where the origin came from, right? And they reported that they just regurgitated what China said, that it didn't start in the lab, with no evidence to support that. Okay. Now, and one of the scientists, I think the only American in that group, was actually involved. He paid, and we're going to get into this later. how he actually, his company had received some funding from the US, which he put towards funding for coronavirus at this Wuhan lab. So there's an obvious conflict of interest there. But let me bring this up. So you hear, oh, scientists were against it. It's true, many were afraid to come out and say, like, what's the evidence? So the lab theory is just as plausible. They were afraid because it was not the dominant cultural narrative. Now that's not supposed to be important in science. What the dominant cultural narrative isn't supposed to affect, or political correctness, that's not supposed to affect science and like scientific logic. But here's an example of a scientist. I'm going to show you an example of a scientist who tried to get the Washington Post to quote him correctly. He said it was plausible. And the Post wouldn't even, they deceptively quoted him without saying, just totally misrepresented him, even though he literally wrote the Post saying, you can quote me saying that it's plausible that it's a lab leak. And they didn't do it. And Michael Tracy did some good reporting on this. He says, this was truly shocking. A key expert cited by the Washington Post for supposedly having, quote, debunked the lab leak theory was in fact a staunch proponent of the theory's viability. The false characterization of his position was then aggregated far and wide across the rest of the media. So this is what he said. So this is Ebright. It could be Ebright. I'll say Ebright is the scientist's name. And he elaborated to Michael Tracy over email regarding this strange discrepancy in how his views were portrayed by the Washington Post. He tells Michael, I discussed the genome sequence and properties of SARS-CoV-2 on the record and the lab accident hypothesis on Background with Washington Post on January 28th, 2020. On the 29th, in 2020, Washington Post quoted him correctly and appropriately that based on the genome sequence and properties of the virus, there was no basis to conclude the virus was engineered. However, immediately after publication that day, the scientist says that he informed Washington Post that he was willing to be quoted on the record that the virus may have entered humans through a laboratory accident. On February 16th, 2020, in an interview regarding comments by Senator Tom Cotton, the scientist says, I again discussed both the genome sequence and the lab accident hypothesis. This time, both on the record with Washington Post. I was surprised that the February 17th, 2020 article in Washington Post quoted only my comments on the genome sequence and not my comments on the lab accident hypothesis. These are your authoritative sources selectively quoting this guy to frame Tom Cotton as a nutcase conspiracy theorist when the scientists they're quoting in their article, their own source, said that he is happy to be quoted as saying that the Wuhan lab accident hypothesis is legitimately plausible. That's freaking incredible, guys. And how did the Washington Post reporter respond when Michael Tracy reached out? When Michael Tracy reached out to this reporter asking, like, when are you going to update this? The scientist that you sourcing, even he asked you to quote him to be supportive of the plausibility of the lab leak hypothesis. And how did she respond? Well, here we go. I'll show it to you. So, and he's got a great screenshot. So he messages the Post person on Twitter, the Post author, the reporter. Fuck it, reporter. And he goes, "Hello, I'm writing an article for Substack that references a Washington Post article by you published on February 2020. In this article, you describe as a conspiracy theory the notion that COVID virus originated in a lab in Wuhan and assert that the theory had been, quote, debunked. But in the years since, more and more evidence has mounted suggesting the theory's plausibility. For example, here's the Washington Post editorial board saying the theory should not be discounted. Do you still think conspiracy theory and debunked were journalistically defensible terms to invoke under the circumstances?" And she disabled her DMs on Twitter after that. You can see that red arrow? You can no longer send messages to this person. I don't know if she blocked him or disabled the messages, but that's pretty funny. That's how, like, what's the word? How, like, defensive and how they're like almost they're allergic to the truth. This is a Washington Post reporter showing you how allergic to the truth she is. All right. Let's get back to more great debunkings. Well, yes, in effect, we are debunking how ridiculous it was to act and report as if the lab leak theory was officially scientifically debunked. That is bullshit. And here, if you don't believe me, here's another great example. So PolitiFact, so they switched it to archived fact check because it was wrong. They finally switched it recently because it's bullshit. And what was the fact check? Oh, it says Tucker Carlson guest airs debunked conspiracy theory that COVID-19 was created in a lab. And they archived that. Put that in the memory hole, baby. So, and they explain here that they've archived it, why they archived it. Because things have changed. Well, it's not just that things have changed now. You could have just realized then how disingenuous such a fact check is. Because in order to call something a debunked conspiracy theory, you need evidence to support that. They didn't have that. Now you could find like one scientist, some scientists saying it was a conspiracy theory and all this, but they didn't have evidence to support it because there's a disturbing lack of evidence. There just is. All right, moving on. Oh, Andrew Holden reminds us that no, it wasn't just New York Times, wasn't just BuzzFeed, wasn't just Washington Post. CNN was at the forefront, writing up a poll dismissively suggesting that an accidental release was, quote, almost certainly not true. Called the lab leak in question, quote, the focus of conspiracy theories. And of course, used it to take shots at President Trump. Well, that's what it was all about. There you go. CNN tweeting out that that's conspiracy theory. And oh my God. And they go, here's another headline. Nearly 30% in the US believe a coronavirus theory that's almost certainly not true, based on no evidence at all. So you can't say it's not true. You can say lack of evidence, but no. They're saying it's certainly not true. That's so fucked up, guys. These are your authoritative sources saying that things are certainly not true, certainly debunked, certainly false, with no evidence to support it. Other than some authority people, authority figures, authority institutions of authority said so. That's all they're going off of. That is a logical fallacy taught in school. That's an appeal to authority. So YouTube is appealing to the authority of authoritative sources who in turn Just appeal to authority. They're just appealing to authority. Oh, good Lord. YouTube's algorithm, they've based it on logical fallacies. A classic logical fallacy. All right, more CNN. And CNN. Oh, wait, let's see. This is, yeah, more CNN. CNN was content to be used as a conduit for Chinese propaganda on the subject, too, seemingly trusting a dishonest, autocratic regime at their word. Now, guys, you know, we hear a lot about like, oh, Russia bad, China bad, Russia bad, China bad. Why are they bad? Because they're authoritative, autocratic, autocratic regimes. Why? Because they literally censor information on the internet. They crack down on dissident journalists and everyday dissidents just speaking online or in public. But that's what we're doing now. That's what America is doing now. That's what America is doing now. To the point where we're just repeating, not just repeating Chinese or propaganda from the Chinese authorities, but we're literally censoring it online. That's what's so bad about China. And we're doing it. Same with Russia. It's just, all right. So here we go. Sorry about the tangent there, but back onto why CNN really sucked on their coronavirus reporting. I'm going to show a video in a second to show you, not a second, a little bit after I get through this thread, show you what they're saying now. See the difference. All right. So, yep, CNN gave free airtime to hostile powers propaganda. That should be indefensible. So, I mean, they do it to U.S. authorities too. In this case, it was just they chose China because they didn't like Trump. All right. We urge the U.S. to stop spreading disinformation. That's just a quote from the Chinese government. China says recent accusations by the Trump administration that the COVID-19 pandemic originated in a lab in Wuhan are a political strategy for Republicans ahead of the 2020 presidential election. Again, this is like you could just totally flip this. It's bullshit on its face. You could say the Democrats attacking Trump for taking this position and, attacking this totally plausible theory as a conspiracy theory is a political strategy for the Democrats in the 2020 presidential election. I mean, you could just say the same thing about the Democrats and the other way around. Here's another headline. China hits back at so-called coronavirus lies by U.S. politicians as war of words escalates. At least in that one, they say so-called lies. So they're quoting China as lies instead of saying it themselves. That's a little bit better. But CNN's done worse. Here's a piece from Chris Cillizza, who is CNN's like adult YouTuber. It's embarrassing. Now, there's nothing wrong with being an adult YouTuber, but this guy, his videos, I don't know. Maybe it's personal because he just fucked over Bernie Sanders and last election, and Chris Cillizza sucks. And here's why he sucks on coronavirus. So in February 2020, he did a piece that points back to a CNN fact check suggesting that you can, quote, draw a line through it and say that didn't happen about the lab release theory. So a totally plausible theory that actually, makes a lot of sense, seeing how they're studying coronavirus at the lab He says, nah, just strike that. Draw a line through it. You can just draw a line through it and say it didn't happen. That's a direct quote. Draw a line through it and say that didn't happen. Jake Tapper at CNN also took a shot at Senator Tim Cotton's view, saying that, let's see, sharing an interview with an expert that Cotton's views were something that he, quote, put in the conspiracy theory bucket. Sorry to keep repeating myself, guys, but there's no evidence to support either theory, the fish market or the lab. And yet only one gets called a conspiracy theory. And while the other one gets promoted as truth. Let's see. Oh dear. Oh, this is good. This is gorgeous. So, luckily, in case your relatives were suggesting that the conspiracy theory about a lab release were true, Oliver Darcy has you covered with this quote, how to debunk coronavirus misinformation and conspiracy theories piece that references the origin of the virus. Oliver Darcy, for you guys who don't know, his whole beat is, fighting social media misinformation. He's one of the main people who basically petitioned to get Alex Jones off YouTube. And here he is himself, Oliver Darcy, pushing misinformation. It's just amazing. And not only that, but he's with CNN, so he gets promoted by the algorithms. These algorithms that are supposedly, put in place to suppress misinformation, harmful misinformation, is indeed, in reality, promoting misinformation from these allegedly authoritative sources like CNN. Oh, NPR too, man. NPR might have been the most dismissive, running stories on back-to-back days, suggesting there was nothing to the allegations and that scientists, quote, debunked the idea of an accidental release. They were, in retrospect, entirely wrong. And here's their headlines. Scientists debunk lab accident theory. That's bullshit. All right. You can't debunk something without evidence to support the debunking. You can't. You see the problem, guys? Like, fine, fine, do a story saying there's little evidence to support the lab leak there. Fine. But you got to also say that there's little evidence to support the fish market theory. That's 2 miles. That's just 2 miles away from the coronavirus study lab. All right. The way that MSNBC and Chris Hayes frame these two separate issues seems instructive. When a theory without enough evidence doesn't help the narrative, it's a conspiracy theory. When it does help the narrative, it's just an open question, even if it's a lot less plausible. Oh, wow. So, MSNBC's Chris Hayes, on the theory that the coronavirus escaped from a lab in Wuhan, China, he says, the Trump administration is so desperately grasping at straws, trying to find someone to blame. They don't even seem to understand what they themselves are saying. Anybody trying to conclude where the origin of the coronavirus is, what the origin is, where it originated. Anybody trying to define that and conclusively especially at the time, still even it was grasping at straws. They're grasping at straws. And yet, Chris Hayes is only saying one theory is grasping at straws. Jesus Christ. And there's a screenshot of another headline with Chris Hayes asking, could Trump be a Russian intelligence asset? Which is a conspiracy theory, because even the Mueller report didn't find evidence of that. All the resources in the world didn't produce any proof that Trump colluded with Russia in the 2016 election. And yet, these people who reported that, they're calling other people conspiracy theorists. And YouTube promotes them. YouTube promotes the conspiracy theorists, the people who promoted conspiracy theorists about Trump-Russia collusion. So again, it's not just the coronavirus. It happened. It's always happening. And the Trump-Russia thing, that was a multi-year lie conspiracy theory promoted by the mainstream media. Now I'm just using that's their definition, conspiracy theory. That's their term. Okay. Perhaps the worst offender, though, was the Washington Post, who in January of 2020 said that Senator Tom Cotton's concerned about a potential lab leak in Wuhan were, quote, fanning the embers of a conspiracy theory that has been repeatedly debunked by experts. Not only, so it had not been debunked, scientifically debunked, legitimately debunked, despite all the throwing away around of headlines of lab theory debunked. It had not been debunked legitimately or scientifically. And yet the Washington Post says that it's conspiracy theory that has been repeatedly debunked. It's funny because it's disturbing because this is the paper of note saying that something is debunked, effectively saying that something has been debunked repeatedly just because headlines had said repeatedly that it had been debunked. That's it. So if headlines say it's debunked, the Washington Post goes, it's been debunked. That's not what journalism is supposed to do. That is bullshit. They say the Washington Post says democracy dies in darkness. Democracy died with the coronavirus, or journalism did. It had died before, but I don't know. How can you say worse than dying? Worse than dead after coronavirus. Here's the headline. Washington Post saying, Tom Cotton keeps repeating a coronavirus conspiracy theory that was already debunked. And by the way, Tom Cotton, he was not saying that it definitively happened in a lab. He was going about it the right way. He said it's plausible it could have happened in the lab. It's plausible it could have happened in the market. It's plausible that it was escaped through the lab through an accident. And hey, it's always also plausible that it was engineered by the Chinese government with nefarious purposes. Now he makes very clear that that was the least likely, he thought. But you can propose these things. Because literally at the time we don't know a damn thing. It just started happening. And the fact that China wasn't giving us any evidence to support their story about it starting naturally in nature and occurring at first in a fish market. So when China's not giving evidence to back up that theory, well, then that theory is no more plausible than other theories if there's no evidence to support it. So anyway, again, Tom Cotton did not say definitively that the coronavirus started in a Wuhan coronavirus lab. He said it could have. And we need to not pretend that it couldn't have. We need to get to the bottom of this. Oh, but that wasn't all from the Washington Post. I don't get how you can fact check something. This is Drew, Drew Holden, the keeper of receipts on Twitter here. I don't get how you can fact check something that we don't know the facts on, nonetheless conclude that one potentially is doubtful. Exactly. I mean, you just said it right there. Beautifully concise. How do you fact check something that we don't know the facts on? Now, see, if PolitiFact was legitimate, was actually legitimate, then they wouldn't fucking fact check something, claim to fact check and debunk something, and define something as false if they were honestly accepting the fact that you cannot fact check something that we don't know the facts on. And there you go. Here's, Washington Post headline. Wuhan accidentally released from a Wuhan lab. It's doubtful. Analysis. President Trump and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo continue to push unsubstantiated Wuhan lab theory on rival coronavirus origins. Now, technically, that's true because those allegations were not substantiated. But the thing is, they at the same time they're saying that the Trump administration's claims are unsubstantiated. They're not saying that China's explanation and that the dominant cultural narrative was also not substantiated. It's completely unsubstantiated. Whew. I know I'm repeating myself, but this is a moment to remember. I mean, this is huge, guys. This from Politico is precisely the type of amnesia that infects reporting like this. 2 months ago, they were lamenting how warnings and concerns about bat research had been ignored. A year before that, they chalked concerns about the Wuhan lab up to, quote, conspiracy theories. Yep. So yeah, there you go. Now, this year, they say diplomats in 2018 warned of risky coronavirus experiments in a Wuhan lab. No one listened. Why didn't people listen, Politico? Why didn't people listen, Politico? Because at the time, and for over a year, the media, including you, Politico, were calling it a conspiracy theory. Here's their tweet from earlier, calling it a conspiracy theory. Reports linked the work to a lab in Wuhan, China, at the center of conspiracy theories about the pandemic's origins. ABC, oh God. Ugh. Here's ABC's headline. Trump admin pulls NIH grant for coronavirus research over ties to Wuhan lab at the heart of conspiracy theories. What the fuck? So there you go, ABC, too, calling it a conspiracy theory with no evidence to back that up. You could just as easily say that the Wuhan or the Wuhan fish market theory is conspiracy theory. NBC News leaned into the same framing, referring to the idea that the virus could have originally come from the Wuhan lab as a conspiracy theory, misinformation. NBC said, where did the coronavirus come from? Past outbreaks provide hints. Although the source wouldn't necessarily help scientists develop vaccines or other drug treatments, it can provide crucial pieces of information on how it emerged. Well, that's all fine. But in the article, what did they say? Yep. But in the fucking article, they say the virus's origin has been the focus of conspiracy theories and other forms of misinformation. In an interview with Fox News on February 16th, Senator Tom Cotton suggested that the coronavirus may have come from a virology laboratory in Wuhan, China, where the outbreak emerged. Others went further by raising the possibility that the virus was a leaked bioweapon. So, you see what they did there? They're framing, so they didn't say outright that Tom Cotton talking about the lab leak theory is a conspiracy theory. They didn't say that outright, but they just put a sentence right before it saying that the virus's origin has been the focus of conspiracy theories and other forms of misinformation. Therefore, that frames the following sentence with Tom Cotton's remarks as conspiracy theory. This is interesting. So CBS News, is reporting how this is last year. Fauci again dismisses Wuhan lab as source of coronavirus. Well, that's different now. So he repeatedly dismissed it as the source of coronavirus. And he's totally changed his fucking tune. Totally changed his tune. In fact, maybe that's a good. It's killing me. Even Reuters, China lab rejects COVID-19 conspiracy claims. At least they said, but virus origin still a mystery. And again, they're just repeating the Chinese government's propaganda. China says, WHO has said no evidence coronavirus was made in a lab. Meanwhile, there's no evidence that it didn't come from a lab. Okay, so this is worth mentioning, I guess. So now I don't like how this is this Drew Holden's framing is a little cruel, but let's mention this. So Drew Holden says, and of course, the usual conspiracy theorists like Max Blumenthal had their own perspective on this one that just happened to neatly fit all of their priors about the world and how it works. Now, and he correctly identifies this is a consistent theme in the thread. So say the same thing about mainstream media. But Max Blumenthal and a lot of alternative media, they correctly are very skeptical of the U.S. government, and sometimes because of that, they will trust other governments more. But you just can't trust something just based on what the government says if the government's not providing any evidence to back it up. Anyway, so Max Blumenthal was wrong on this too. He says that COVID escaping from a Chinese lab was also a conspiracy there. So, I think it's fair. Let's bring it up now. But here's the thing. So yes, it's not just mainstream media that gets things wrong. However, what's fucked up is that mainstream media can get things wrong and they're fucking promoted by these all-powerful social media algorithms. That's incredibly fucked up. Meanwhile, people who were right about the Wuhan, or at least right to not dismiss the Wuhan lab leak theory, they've had their videos removed, demonetized, and on and on. Labeled false on Facebook. It's bad. All right. So let's go from CBS News, as I said, here's the headlines. Fauci, he dismissed the Wuhan labs as a source of coronavirus repeatedly. So let's see what Fauci says now, and what CNN says now.
Dr. Anthony Fauci now says he's not sure exactly how coronavirus came to infect humans and left open the possibility that the virus could have come from a lab.
Are you still confident that it developed naturally?
No, I'm not convinced about that. I think that we should continue to investigate what went on in China until we find out, to the best of our ability, exactly what happened.
To be clear, Dr. Fauci never said that COVID-19 did not come from a lab. What he said was there was no scientific evidence supporting that it did. And later in that very same...
Except there was no scientific evidence supporting that it didn't. Now, they claimed that you could put coronavirus under the microscope and you could see that you couldn't see that anything had been copy and pasted as it would have been in a virology lab. But the thing is, there is technology now where you can copy and paste information in the virus and it not be perceivable. So it wasn't legit evidence. I got to listen to that again because it's so funny. So Fauci repeatedly dismissed the Wuhan lab as a source of coronavirus. And what does he say
Dr.
now?
Anthony Fauci now says he's not sure exactly how coronavirus came to infect humans and left open the possibility that the virus could have come from a lab.
Are you still confident that it developed naturally?
No, I'm not convinced about that. I think that we should continue to investigate what went on in China until we find out, to the best of our ability, exactly what happened.
Why the fuck wouldn't you say that at the beginning? This is only like the most deadly virus in recent history that's killed millions of people. You knew it was going to kill millions of people. And you just dismissed totally plausible theories of its origin? That's so fucking like irresponsible and fucked up. All right, it's good he's saying this now. Why the fuck didn't he say that before? Oh, why didn't he say it before? Well, maybe it's because he was at an institution that was funding research at the Wuhan lab in China. This exact same lab in China that was studying the coronavirus that the coronavirus may have escaped from. Maybe that's why. All right. Let's see. Ooh, here's a good one. This is good. But this is too good. I'll come back to the CNN thing. Well, but this is so good. So Josh Barr, I don't know who he is, but he makes a great point. It damages the New York Times reputation to have a key reporter on the most important story of the year say a valid news angle shouldn't be discussed because it has, quote, racist roots. Aren't they supposed to be in the news business? So even now, there is a New York Times reporter who's mainly focused on COVID-19. That is her news beat. And she just tweeted. Let's see. She just tweeted yesterday that someday we will stop talking about the lab leak theory and maybe even admit its racist roots. But alas, that day is not yet here. What the fuck? This is a New York Times reporter saying that you can't talk about the lab leak theory. You can't talk about a plausible theory. You can't even consider seriously trying to figure out the origin of this virus. You can't consider legitimate possibilities in researching this deadly virus because it's racist? What the fuck is racist about this? There's nothing racist about that. There's nothing. And also, how is it racist to say it started in a lab in China, a coronavirus? How did lab in China and not a wet market in China? What the fuck? This is insane. And here we go. Oh, Glenn Greenwald puts it a little more concisely. Can someone explain to me why it's racist to wonder if a virus escaped from a Chinese lab, but it's not racist to insist that it infected humans because of Chinese wet markets? And then, Glenn is horrified when he discovered that this woman is a New York Times reporter whose main beat is coronavirus. So you have a reporter for the paper of note who is actively dismissing a plausible theory for them, actively discouraging people from investigating how the most deadly virus in recent history originated. She's actively discouraging people from investigating a deadly virus. And New York Times reporter whose beat is the coronavirus is actively discouraging people from investigating the virus. Not only that, but she's smearing them as racists. Oh boy. Oh boy. All right. I accept tips. All right. Because unfortunately, this is probably going to get demonetized. Thank you, ABCD. Yeah. Who says this calls for a legendary ORF compilation showing all the stupid media takes dismissing the lab leak since last year. That's a good idea. All right. Let's
To be clear,
continue to see how, CNN is, after dismissing the theory along with Dr. Fauci and the rest of the media, here's how they're reporting it now.
Dr. Fauci never said that COVID-19 did not come from a lab. What he said was there was no scientific evidence supporting that it did. And
even though there was no scientific evidence supporting that it didn't.
Later in that very same interview, Fauci said investigators still say the spread was likely natural, meaning zoonotic, starting from an animal that transmitted it to humans, which has long been the explanation that was more broadly considered as likely, that it began in Wuhan's seafood market, where there were also a number of animals. So how did we get here? With America's most prominent public health expert saying that the lab leak theory, which was previously hawked by conspiracy theorists,
she's still calling them conspiracy theorists. She's still calling anybody who talked about the possibility of a Wuhan lab leak conspiracy theorists in the same segment where she's acknowledging that even Dr. Fauci says is plausible and should be explored. What the fuck?
Might actually be credible. The lab leak theory that the coronavirus pandemic originated in some fashion in a laboratory in Wuhan has been circulating in the United States almost as long as the virus. One of the first elected officials to promote this theory was Senator Tom Cotton, who said this back in February of 2020.
We don't have evidence that this disease originated there, but because of China's duplicity and dishonesty from the beginning, we need to at least ask the question to see what the evidence says.
Now, Cotton clarified that he didn't think that China intentionally released the virus, but this lab leak theory became a popular hypothesis in conservative circles around that time.
Why? Why just conservative circles? Because the Democratic Party aligned media, let's face it, Washington Post, New York Times, they slant Democrat. They were dismissing it as conspiracy theory. So you have at least half the country, if not more, just totally dismissing the possibility that this came from a lab leak, which is dangerous. It's dangerous. Because we need to know how this started. Because millions of people have died. And it's just shameful and dangerous to dismiss any possibility, to have no page unturned. To leave no page unturned, and yet they fucking they crumpled that page up, throw it in the wastebasket, lit it on fire. Ugh. I mean, at least
in April
they're
of last
talking
year,
about
a
it
Washington
a little bit now. At least they're talking about it a little bit now.
Washington Post columnist highlighted State Department cable's warning of safety issues at the lab in Wuhan.
So there's been evidence to support the lab leak theory. She just listed some. So there were State Department cables warning of safety issues at the Wuhan lab. Yet that got ignored. Now you can look up now. People are reporting on how workers at the lab, 3 workers, came down with coronavirus symptoms before, coronavirus was a known thing. And so, I mean, if people working at the lab came down with coronavirus symptoms early on, before we knew coronavirus was a public menace, was an actual thing spreading around the world, then maybe it started in that lab. It's totally plausible. And so you see now there's articles on it, new articles on it, but we knew that way back then. We knew that in the Trump administration. At the end of the Trump administration, they released a report on this. Now she's citing, and then Washington Post only covers it a few months later.
Cable's warning of safety issues.
But see, the Trump administration was, they didn't reference this before, but it turns out they did have, this is an example of some of the information they were going off of, even though it wasn't public until the end of the administration.
At the lab in Wuhan. CNN and other news organizations also reported that U.S. intelligence and national security officials were investigating whether coronavirus may have spread from a Chinese laboratory rather than the market in Wuhan. Former President Trump said this when asked about it.
We're looking at it. A lot of people are looking at it. It seems to make sense.
In that same news conference, Dr. Fauci was less than enthusiastic about the theory, though.
The mutations that it took to get to the point where it is now is totally consistent with a jump of a species from an animal to a human.
Now, that was April of last year. New coronavirus cases were quickly increasing. Lockdowns were in place in key states, and many Republicans were trying to turn blame for the worsening situation from Trump's policies to China. The National Republican senator quickly
let me just go back. So when Fauci says that, it doesn't look like it started in the lab, as I said before, there's new technology that we can copy and paste in the lab, and it doesn't look like it was done in the lab. Now, he leaves all that out.
Trying to turn blame for the worsening situation from Trump's policies to China. The National Republican Senatorial Committee even reportedly sent candidates a memo that told them this, quote, "Don't defend Trump other than the China travel ban, attack China." And 2 weeks later, this was Trump.
Have you seen anything at this point that gives you a high degree of confidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of this virus?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have. There's a lot of theories, but yeah, we have people looking at it very, very strongly.
Gives you
Scientific people, intelligence people, and others.
And what gives
And
you
we're going to put it all together. I think we're going to have a very good answer eventually.
and what gives you
And
a
China
high,
might even tell us. China may tell us.
and what gives you a high degree of confidence that this originated from the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
I can't tell you that. I'm not allowed to tell you that.
That's
Okay, so at the time, and it's fair, so he wasn't substantiating that argument with evidence, but there was evidence, and we know that now because it came in at the end of his administration, right before Joe Biden took office. The State Department released all this. The Trump State Department released their evidence, including that a few of the employees at the Wuhan lab came up with coronavirus symptoms before we knew of coronavirus. So maybe that was the beginning of it.
same day, the New York Times. Senior Trump administration officials, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, had pushed spies to find evidence linking COVID to the Wuhan lab.
All right, let's just. Okay. Sorry, I got to fast forward. It's just boring.
About finding a scapegoat as he made racist comments deflecting from his own poor political performance and coincided with higher rates of hate crimes against Asian Americans.
Okay, so is it racist to call a virus that originated in China a China virus? Is that racist? I don't know. Let's see. It's certainly not racist. I don't think so. I just don't. Sorry. And to dismiss it as racist is just wrong to me. And like it's certainly, at least certainly the way that New York Times reporter was framing it on Twitter, saying that anybody considering this theory, just considering the theory, is racist. That's absolutely insane. That I know for sure. And so let's see what her example of racism is.
It's got all different names. Wuhan. Wuhan was catching on. Coronavirus, right? Kung flu, yeah. Kung flu. COVID-19.
All right, so he makes that joke kung fu having originated from China, and the coronavirus, similar to the flu in many ways, also coming from China. Play on words, kung flu. Is that really racist? And even if you think that's racist, the media is currently using that as a bullshit excuse for why they dismissed the Wuhan lab leak theory. You cannot, and they're still doing it, like that New York Times reporter. You can't dismiss a scientific theory, a legitimate hypothesis, because a president says something that offends you. What the fuck is wrong with you?
So our next guest has been making the case for more than a year that it is a real possibility that the virus leaked from a lab. Joining us, vaccine scientist and professor at Flinders University in Australia, Nikolai Petrovsky. Professor, thank you so much for being with us. As we said, you've been consistent that this is something that should be investigated, that it is a possibility. So what's not?
So this guy in the middle, he's a scientist, and he's been skeptical from the very start, and he says some good things
Being done that you think needs to be done?
Well, we need a proper investigation. I mean, we're 18 months into this pandemic, and no one can show where this virus came from. Obviously, there are multiple theories, and I'm pleased to say that the idea it might have come from a lab is no longer considered a conspiracy theory, but is
It only took over a year.
a serious scientific question. But to answer that question,
It only took over a year for the media to stop smearing a legitimate scientific question as a conspiracy theory. Not just a legitimate scientific question, but one of the most important questions there is. How do we stop another virus from killing millions of people? Well, we got to know what started this. That'd help.
we need access to the appropriate records of what was happening in China at the beginning of this. And clearly, the Chinese have indicated that they're not prepared to share those records. So it's going to be very hard to get to the bottom of it without some sort of investigation conducted internationally.
Why do you think it has been this evolution from, oh, this seems to be a conspiracy theory, to this really could be credible? Why was the scientific community reticent to go there?
Great question. Let's hear what he says.
Well, I think this is the problem of when science gets mixed with politics. And I've been saying consistently for more than a year now, let's separate out the politics. And as a group of scientists, let's look at this as a serious scientific question. And when you do that, I mean, in science, you just have to look at all of the possible alternatives and then rule them in or out based on the evidence. And that clearly wasn't being done. And I think scientists, became politicians and took sides in this debate. And
it wasn't just scientists. It was the media that also became politicians and took sides in this debate. God, but that's disturbing. Yeah, even for scientists to do it, and it's true, some scientists did do it. But the media did too, and it's just, what a recipe for disaster. These are two of our institutions, the media and science, that are supposed to be critical thinkers. And neither group did that when it came to the most important question of our time, which is where the fuck did this coronavirus originate? So how the fuck can we prevent it from happening again?
That should never have happened, and I'm pleased to see scientists returning to their senses and actually starting to look at this as a serious scientific question and leaving the politics out of the question.
What piece of data or data set could answer the question?
Look, I don't think there's any one, smoking gun in this situation. I mean, that would require
Okay, this guy is great. CNN should have had him on over a year ago. But people like him were being smeared as a conspiracy theorist for a year last year. Now, it's good that CNN is, covering they're not covering this as they fucked themselves over, but it's good that they've changed their tune to be more fair now and not misleading people, at least on this issue as much. And but here's the thing. So this video talking about the Wuhan lab theory, it's not demonetized. In fact, it's promoted by YouTube. Still to this day, YouTube is demonetizing and suppressing independent channels who are saying some of the same stuff that this scientist is saying on CNN. Some of the same stuff that this CNN pundit interviewing him has said in this video. That's so wrong. It's so wrong. And I'm going to show you one that just got demonetized today. and it actually gives even more. It just goes way more in depth, and it gives much more information, all cited than this CNN clip. Not that, I mean, this what this guy's saying is good, but this other video that's not by corporate news, his video just got demonetized. So I'm going to play that after this one, and we'll compare, and we'll have to try and find if you can find any legitimate reason why it is demonetized and the CNN one is not.
Effectively a confession. If someone was handling this in a laboratory, it's going to be very hard to prove that without someone coming forward and telling us what's happened. On the other side, of course, the longer we go, and despite all the massive searches for an animal source of this virus, and the fact that no one has come up with such a source, obviously increasingly that means the weight of the doubt must be that, this did actually come from a laboratory. So I think we're going to be dealing with a lot of circumstantial evidence, both scientific and obviously our research showed that this virus had very unusual features for a pandemic virus. It was perfectly adapted to infect humans from the very first case, and that's quite unusual. There are obviously some very unusual features in the virus that we don't see in other closely related coronaviruses. So there are a number of worrying features in the virus that suggest it came from a lab. I think all we can do is continue to look for circumstantial evidence that might point in one direction or the other. I'm not sure that we'll ever have someone fess up and tell us what really happened.
That seemed to be Redfield's point, was as far as he could tell, he thought there seemed to be some missing links in the evolution of this virus. Where did that happen? And look, China has to answer some questions so that we can know definitively the answer to that.
She just said China, and correct, she said correctly, China has to answer some questions so we can know definitively where this came from. It's such a basic question. And CNN and nobody else in the media, at least the corporate media, asked that basic fucking question. China, can you explain? Can you explain why, how this came from a fish market and not the lab 2 miles away that was studying coronavirus, which was funded by U.S. money too, partly funded by U.S. money. So this is not an anti-China thing. This would, look bad or reflect poorly on the U.S. too, because the U.S. was funding what's called gain of function research at the lab, which is known to be dangerous. In fact, it had been disallowed for a while, but I believe it was Fauci that funded this research either while it was disallowed by the government or some short time after. So, all right, let's see what independent channels are saying and have been saying. This is a channel called China Uncensored, which today shared this screenshot from YouTube telling them that, quote, after manually reviewing your video, we've confirmed that it isn't suitable for all advertisers. So it got demonetized. What video got demonetized? Well, it's their video titled Wuhan Coronavirus Lab Leak No Longer a Conspiracy Theory, which is just what that fucking CNN video was on YouTube. It was talking about how the Wuhan Coronavirus Lab Leak is no longer a conspiracy theory. But the independent, the regular person, the regular everyday people, they got their video demonetized. Now, as I believe it's my duty as a American citizen who cares about these issues, who cares about this scary power that YouTube is wielding in support of authoritative sources about YouTube supporting corporate media, I think it's my duty to play my part in the Streisand effect, and I'm going to show you this video that was just demonetized by YouTube. It's got a lot of good information, and let's see if we can figure out why the hell YouTube demonetized it and not the CNN video.
It's called fringe, foolish, debunked. But now, people are finally admitting.
This is from, again, the channel is called China Uncensored. And the irony, guys, the irony that, so you have YouTube, it used to be a place where you could create content that would get censored by governments. So in China in particular, which is an especially censorious government, citizens they used sites like YouTube and just the internet in general to say things that they could not say, never say, in the Chinese media or even in public. So obviously China has now censored, firewalled much of the internet. I'm pretty sure YouTube, I know certainly Facebook has the social media in general, in many instances has assisted China and other authoritarian governments around the world in censoring content. But anyway, just the irony of, but now YouTube, American corporations, America is censoring this content too. Censoring content that is dissidents of China, that is critical of China's authoritarian government. That's nuts. That's really scary shit right there. So here we go. Without further ado, here's China Uncensored and their latest video to get demonetized for talking about coronavirus. Or in this case, the Wuhan lab leak that everyone else is allowed to talk about if and only if you're in corporate media. Everyone else outside of corporate media, not allowed to talk about it without getting demonetized. Here we go. Let's see. Why were they demonetized? I can't figure it out. Maybe you guys can figure it out.
Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This episode is sponsored by CuriosityStream.
All right, let's.
It's great for people like you who love its creative.
CuriosityStream.
The theory is that the CCP virus may have come from an accidental lab leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That theory has been discussed since the beginning of the outbreak, but it was for the most part dismissed as a conspiracy theory. If you talked about the idea of a lab leak, you were lumped in with QAnon supporters who thought that Bill Gates created the coronavirus, which is obviously ridiculous. Bill Gates didn't create the coronavirus. He was too busy hanging out with Jeffrey Epstein. Last February, the predominant theory about the coronavirus was that it came from bats or possibly pangolins before jumping to humans. And this seemed to make sense, because that's how other coronaviruses like SARS and MERS first spread to humans. At first, the spread of the CCP virus was supposed to have happened here, at the Huanan Seafood Market. It's a wet market in Wuhan where exotic animals were sold. Many of the early cases were traced back to the market. Again, it seemed to make sense because a wet market is how SARS was first spread in China back in 2002. But there were problems with this theory. One, some early cases of COVID-19 occurred in people with no known link to the wet market. Another problem, the wet market didn't sell bats or pangolins. And even a year and a half after the initial outbreak, scientists have not found a bat or pangolin or any other host species infected with the CCP virus. That's unusual. The host species of the original SARS virus was identified within 4 months of the SARS outbreak, and the host of MERS within 9 months. So while the zoonotic theory that it jumped from bats to humans naturally makes sense, there's not really any evidence for it so far. But who needs evidence when you can just leap to conclusions? Follow the science. Then there's the lab leak theory. Again, the theory is not that the CCP virus was created as a bioweapon and unleashed on the world.
Okay, so I wouldn't be surprised. I think it's wrong. It would be wrong to demonetize his channel or this video for calling the coronavirus CCP virus or China Communist Party virus. That would be wrong for him to do that. For YouTube to do that, because just consider how American media and our public, a lot of Americans generally blamed the coronavirus deaths, if not the coronavirus as a whole, on Trump and the Trump administration. So if that's okay, it's kind of absurd. But if that's okay, then certainly there should not be an issue with this guy naming the coronavirus after the Chinese Communist Party. Again, it's a political party. He's not calling it, not tying the virus to a race of people, but the government, who was overseeing this lab, I believe, this Wuhan lab.
The lab leak theory is that scientists were experimenting on a bat coronavirus at a lab in Wuhan, and it accidentally leaked. To their credit, a handful of scientists and journalists have been pushing all along for an investigation into the lab leak theory. But for the most part, if you talked about the lab leak theory, the media basically treated you like you were this guy. Later in this episode, I'll talk more about how the US mainstream media's dismissive reports basically wrote the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda for them. But first, there's been growing evidence over the past year that makes a lab leak look much more likely. We've been talking about this on China Uncensored for more than a year. And some of the Chinese Communist Party's actions are a bit suspicious. Well, okay, I need to narrow that down. How the party treated this specific lab in Wuhan was suspicious.
A fucking YouTubers were more skeptical of the Chinese government than the American media. What the fuck? These are just basic questions that the American media, corporate media, refused to ask, and instead just regurgitated the Chinese government's talking points.
In January, the Chinese military posted its top epidemiologist to the Wuhan lab. In February, Chinese leader Xi Jinping began talking about biosafety reforms in labs. That's an odd response to a coronavirus that supposedly came from a wet market. And as the US began to investigate the origin of the coronavirus, the Communist Party began to heavily censor academic research about the origin of the virus. I mean, science and public health are always best served when communist officials are looking over scientists' work.
So that's worth noting. That's a little red flag everyone should have noticed. And that is, so China was literally censoring scientific papers that were tying the Wuhan lab, virology lab, to as the origin of the coronavirus. Meanwhile, American social media was censoring the same kind of material. And how fucked up is that? So the U.S. companies are censoring. Their censorship is almost in line with the Chinese government's. That's nuts. Like, it's like America doesn't stand for anything anymore.
By the way,
We used to be better than China because we cared about free speech. We used to be better than Russia because we cared about free speech. Doesn't seem like that's the case anymore.
YouTube demonetized that episode for portraying harmful and dangerous acts. I can only assume it means that the Communist Party's covering up the origin of a global pandemic is a harmful and dangerous act. Right, YouTube? More after the break. Welcome back. Did you actually see an ad?
Probably not. Probably didn't see an ad. I'm guessing nobody has seen an ad on this too. But the that's also pretty incredible. That this video was demonetized for, quote, harmful or dangerous acts. So all he's done is just talk about the theories of how the coronavirus started. And now he hasn't said anything that hasn't been said in corporate media now. Now corporate media's said the same stuff. And yet not only is this demonetized, but it's called harmful and dangerous. What? What's harmful and dangerous? Seriously, type it in the comments. What is harmful and dangerous about this? I'd like to know. And it's not just this fucking China Uncensored channel. I've had my videos called harmful and dangerous, demonetized for being harmful and dangerous. What the fuck? Go find a video of mine that's harmful and dangerous. How are any of my videos harmful and dangerous?
Last year, the lab leak theory was largely dismissed based on 2 letters. Not research papers, but letters. Essentially opinion articles from scientists. The first was published in The Lancet on February 19, 2020, and signed by virologists and other scientists. It says, "We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin." The letter also called for the scientific community to support and stand with the scientists of China. It turns out that letter was written by Dr. Peter Daszak. I've talked about Daszak before because he was also on the World Health Organization team that went to China to investigate the origin of the coronavirus. Of course, the party didn't actually let them investigate, and Daszak didn't complain. But that's another story. Daszak is the president of EcoHealth Alliance, a nonprofit group that, among other things, studies viruses in the wild. In emails, Daszak told other scientists that he wanted this letter to avoid the appearance of a political statement, and that it was just about supporting Chinese scientists who are under serious pressure. Maybe that's what he wanted to do. But by calling the lab leak theory a conspiracy theory, Daszak was making a political statement. Also, Daszak and the EcoHealth Alliance had a massive conflict of interest here. They were funding research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology through US government grants. So if a lab leak did happen there, they'd be in a lot of trouble. But you'd never know that from this Lancet letter, because the authors, including Daszak, declared they had no competing interests. Remember this, it's important later. The second letter was published in Nature Medicine. It said that the author's analyses clearly show that the coronavirus is not a laboratory construct of a purposefully manipulated virus. But it turns out that letter did not clearly show that at all. One of the letter's main arguments was that the CCP virus genome did not show any signs of cutting and pasting. But there are newer methods of manipulating a virus that don't leave any marks, including the no.
So he's just so you know, this author, these Medium articles he's citing is by a science reporter for the New York Times, not currently, but he was for 20 years. So he is a good source. And more importantly, what he writes about in this specific article, he sources.
Or seamless approaches and something called serial passage. Despite the problems with these two letters, the media used them as the basis for article after article debunking the lab leak theory. But there's actually a lot more evidence now for the lab leak theory than the zoonotic theory. Specifically, evidence shows that it's very possible the Wuhan Institute of Virology was manipulating this virus to make it more infectious to humans. Here's evolutionary biologist Brett Weinstein.
But the fact that there is no evidence, that it shows up in Wuhan and immediately spreads, tells us that this virus was well adapted to our cells and well adapted to transmit between individuals. And that is conspicuous. One way you could get there is if somebody, A, had added components to a virus in order to make it transmissible to humans. So the research in question would be research that was interested in discovering what a pandemic in humans of a bat-borne coronavirus would be like so that we could do something about it. Maybe we could prevent it. Maybe we could create a vaccine ahead of time.
If you think it sounds insane to take a virus and make it more infectious to humans, don't worry. Virologists do this all the time. They're called gain-of-function experiments. Virologists have recreated the 1918 flu virus, shown how the almost extinct polio virus can be synthesized from its published DNA sequence, and introduced a smallpox gene into a related virus. So virologists are using DNA to recreate deadly extinct viruses. It's just like Jurassic Park.
So we're watching this because I'm trying to figure out, and you let me know in the contents, guys, why YouTube has labeled this harmful or dangerous. Why? He said nothing so far that the mainstream media hasn't also talked about. Nothing. And I see somebody has an issue with him having on Brett Weinstein, who is a evolutionary biologist. So hello, virus biology. He has some expertise in this area. So certainly more than most people commenting on it. So yeah, so far I see no reason why this video,
you can't run away from
China
the
Uncensored,
conspiracy theory,
has been suppressed and called harmful and dangerous for saying the same stuff that even mainstream media sources are acknowledging now. So anyway, let's see.
more concerning. It turns out that a lot of the bat coronavirus research was not being done in the BSL-4 labs, but in the much less strict BSL-2 and 3 level labs. Biosafety level 4 looks like this, basically a full-body spacesuit. Biosafety level 2 looks like this. It just requires you to wear a lab coat and gloves, and possibly a face shield or goggles if liquids might splash. Last March, Americans were practically sterilizing their groceries at biosafety level 2. For a lab, that doesn't seem like enough protection, and it might not have been. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that 3 researchers from China's Wuhan Institute of Virology became sick enough in November 2019 that they sought hospital care. That was based on a U.S. intelligence report. That's not completely new information. It's partly based on this fact sheet the Trump administration released back in January. But as more information gets reported, it's clear there needs to be an investigation into the lab leak theory. So why has it taken a year and a half for most mainstream media to take the lab leak theory seriously? I'll tell you after the break. Welcome back. Ever since people started talking about the lab leak theory in January 2020, the mainstream media has treated it like a conspiracy theory. Like I said earlier, one reason
They didn't just treat it as a conspiracy theory, they straight up called it a conspiracy theory over and over and over again. A conspiracy theory that they are now acknowledging over a year later as a plausible theory. Back to the video that that YouTube has demonetized for being harmful and dangerous. Still waiting for anybody to identify something in this that is harmful or dangerous or even different from what is being reported now in the mainstream media.
was that they believed the flawed Lancet and Nature letters from scientists without looking into them further. Another reason was the media kept conflating the lab leak theory with the accusation the CCP virus was created to be a bioweapon. And a third big reason the media treated the lab leak theory as a conspiracy theory was because of who was saying it.
All right, I'm just going to rewind it for a second. So he's correctly saying that one of the reasons, or at least according to the media, one of their excuses for falsely labeling this theory false based on no evidence was because some people tacked on an additional theory that not only was the origin of the coronavirus in this lab, but that it was done so intended as a bioweapon. And if you cannot distinguish, it's absurd. You shouldn't be reporting if you can't distinguish the theory that it originated in this lab and the separate theory that it originated in the lab with in mind to become a bioweapon. Then you shouldn't be reporting on coronavirus. I mean, if you're looking at it scientifically, if you're looking at it objectively, if you're looking at it honestly and critically, no reporter has any right to say that their excuse, well, they have a right to say it, but it's bullshit. It is a bullshit excuse to say that you dismiss the lab leak theory as a conspiracy theory because you dismiss the lab leak theory being a bio weapon as is a conspiracy theory. Fuck it, I'm losing it. But you see the difference. It's easy to distinguish between the two. One is a theory that is original in a lab. Another is that it originated in a lab that was created for the purpose of producing bioweapons. There's a big difference between those theories. It's fucked up to convolute them, and that's what the media did, and that's what the media is giving as an excuse for not giving the lab leak theory a fair framing in the reporting.
Republicans. Back in February 2020, Senator Tom Cotton said that there needed to be an investigation into the lab leak theory. The New York Times accused him of repeating a fringe theory. The Washington Post called it a conspiracy theory that was already debunked. As time went on, most mainstream media just ignored this story, unless they were trying to further debunk it. Especially after President Trump said this.
Have you seen anything at this point that gives you a high degree of confidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of this virus?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have. And I think that the World Health Organization should be ashamed of themselves because they're like the public relations agency for China.
Well, he's not wrong about the World Health Organization. But to the media, suddenly the lab leak theory became President Trump's theory, and they had to debunk it. They claimed experts called it foolish. They said Fauci crushed Trump's theory. Dr. Fauci, by the way, is the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the government organization that gave Peter Daszak the grants that he then gave to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But the point is, the lab leak theory became a victim of the mainstream media's culture war against Trump. A former New York Times science writer says he thought the lab leak theory was far right and equated it to Pizzagate and QAnon. That same New York Times writer now grudgingly admits it could be true. But for well over a year, people who talked about the lab leak theory were discredited. In some cases, they were banned from social media. It couldn't have worked out.
Guys, that I mean, I can't just pass that by. Like, people were banned from social media for just talking about this coronavirus lab leak theory. That's so fucked up. Twitter was doing the work of an authoritarian government. Now, we know so if they're going to do that for China, you know they'll do it, for the US government too. It's really scary stuff.
Let the party cover up its own responsibility. Let the party from social media.
Yes, I have. Yes, I have.
At this point that gives you,
Because they're like the public.
They claimed experts called it foolish. They said Fauci crushed Trump's theory. Dr. Fauci, by the way, is the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the government organization that gave Peter Daszak the grants that he then gave to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But the point is,
that's big. That's big. And for some reason, that wasn't commented on over a year ago very much. Certainly not by the mainstream media. That Fauci had a connection to the funding for this Wuhan lab that was studying the coronavirus that may have accidentally leaked the virus. That's pretty huge, guys.
lab leak theory became a victim of the mainstream media's culture war against Trump. A former New York Times science writer says he thought the lab leak theory was far right and equated it to Pizzagate and QAnon. That same New York Times writer now grudgingly admits it could be true. But for well over a year, people who talked about the lab leak theory were discredited. In some cases, they were banned from social media.
Twitter suspends account of Chinese virologist who claimed coronavirus was made in a lab. What the fuck? Just think about that, guys. Oh, so disturbing. You're suspending you suspended somebody, a virologist, for claiming coronavirus was made in the lab. We know that's what the lab was doing. They were studying coronavirus. And they were doing gain of function research. You talk about that, dude got banned. When it totally mirrors what China was doing itself. Twitter's doing what China does. China had studies removed. Twitter will ban you. It's just, again, and this is just asking legitimate questions, offering fair commentary, reasonable commentary. That is the kind of, and talking reasonable, asking fair questions, that gets you censored by the Chinese government. That's what they did to scientists who proposed this theory. And it is also what will get you banned by Twitter. What the fuck?
It couldn't have worked out better for the Chinese Communist Party. Chinese state-run media didn't even have to spend much energy denying the lab leak theory. The Western media did it for them, and much more effectively too. All the Global Times had to do was show a screenshot of the New York Times. It's quite disturbing that the mainstream media, because of their own biases, ended up handing the Chinese regime a propaganda coup for so long, something that let the party cover up its own responsibility for the CCP virus and continue to lie to the rest of the world. But that might be over soon, because the media have discovered that, hey, this lab leak theory suddenly became credible. Yes, suddenly. And the media is now in full backpedaling mode. They might even start doing some actual reporting on the lab leak theory. You know, investigate something. So what happens now that the lab leak theory is no longer a conspiracy theory? Everyone is calling for an investigation. Some scientists say that even without China's cooperation, Congress should start an investigation in the US. And hey, if this global pandemic thing did start with a lab leak in Wuhan, maybe the US government shouldn't fund gain-of-function research in China. Just a thought. But now, this issue is...
And guys, that wouldn't be new. Like in the past, gain-of-function research has been limited. Like you weren't allowed. Government said we were not going to fund this stuff. They had restrictions on that. That changed briefly. So we knew that this stuff is potentially dangerous. This kind of research is potentially dangerous. And so to have that conversation is not new or controversial. And I'm going to ask again, why is this video? I don't get who this guy, what's his damn name? Chris something at China Uncensored. Whether you like him or not, whether you like the channel or not, is anything he said harmful or dangerous? Anything that deserves demonetization? Anything that deserves that label of harmful or dangerous by YouTube?
Is a lot more dangerous for the Chinese Communist Party. They can't rely on Western media to be their propaganda arm anymore. On this topic, at least. So I wouldn't be surprised if some Chinese scientists suddenly find the missing animal host for a natural zoonotic transmission of the coronavirus. Like mink. Maybe it's mink. Mink sounds good. Thanks, state-run media. When the Chinese propaganda machine ramps into gear to counter the lab leak theory, the real question is, will the Western media fall for it, or have they learned their lesson? And this episode has been sponsored by Curiosity.
All right. Wonderful. So now the dude freaking I mean, yeah, at the end he basically sets you up. He says like, "Oh, if there is evidence that comes out to support that it wasn't an accidental leak from a lab, don't believe it." It's basically what he's saying. But again, I don't think that's harmful or dangerous. And if you do think it's harmful or dangerous, you'd have to admit that saying the same shit, or even worse, calling one theory a total conspiracy theory, like the mainstream media did for over a year, is certainly harmful or dangerous. That is harmful or dangerous, actually. That was harmful and dangerous. At a time where we should have been figuring out where the hell this came from, we weren't doing that because the media just put us to sleep, just put people to sleep, and shamed anybody who asked the basic common sense, reasonable questions like, could it have possibly come from a lab studying coronavirus? Could coronavirus possibly have come from a lab studying coronavirus? That's only 2 miles from the Wuhan fish market that the government says it started at. Anyway, so I think that may be it for tonight. Thank you, Eric G. Says, great job covering this. Thumbs up. You won't last long on CorpTube. Are you on Rockfin? Also, question, is Kim Iverson a good source? So, all right, great. I appreciate the tip and I appreciate the questions. So, Eric G, yeah, saying I won't last long on corporate tube, which YouTube has become. Hey, who knows, man? I'm certainly having my stuff demonetized. I'm probably going to report soon on videos that they've demonetized and age restricted of mine, which I think is nuts, including a video that I titled Myth of Time, which has historic footage of the civil rights movement. They freaking age restricted it, saying that it was too shocking and disgusting. It's called Historic Civil Rights Movement Footage, Shocking and Disgusting. What the fuck? Now, granted, police brutality footage can be shocking, but it's not posted to shock and disgust. It's posted to educate. And it's important. You can't suppress that stuff. If you really actually care about racism, like YouTube and all these corporations propose to be against racism, and yet you're seriously going to suppress important historic civil rights footage or footage of the civil rights movement with MLK getting arrested, hoses being sprayed on peaceful protesters, dogs being used to attack peaceful protesters. They literally age restricted that footage, or the whole video, just because it had that footage in it. This is a video where it's just all the video is Martin Luther King's own words with civil rights movement footage overlaid on top of it. Anyway, I need to make a whole video just about that to explain that, because unfortunately it's been age restricted for many, many months and YouTube's not doing anything about it. I can't get enough people to retweet about it. So I have to, I can't just let that happen. I have to try my best to get the word out about that, because I think that's fucking nuts and wrong. That's just wrong. I was taught about the civil rights movement in fucking elementary school. I saw some of these images in elementary school. These images are what fucking got who was it at the time? Kennedy seeing this on the TV? Then LBJ? Literally, these images, they said, are what got their attention to actually do something and pass civil rights legislation. And we're going to ban high school students from watching that? That's scary, man. That's nuts. All right. But now, Eric G, your second question. Oh, got a couple more questions. Are you on Rockfin? I'm not on Rockfin. Had a really weird experience with Rockfin. They were going to set me up. And they never did, though. And I just kept asking, all right, I created this account, and they never let it go online. So, no, I'm not on Rockfin. Thanks to Rockfin. So, fuck Rockfin. Let's see. And but I am on Odyssey. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Make sure you click the bell. Thumbs up and all that is appreciated. Also, Patreon. I post all my stuff there and more. Get to see sneak peeks. I need all the help I can get because videos are getting demonetized all the fucking time. You also asked, is Kim Iverson a good source? Honestly, I haven't seen anything bad. I don't watch her, so I don't know. I've seen clips. Seems legit to me. But as always, and I'll say the same thing about myself, you can't just take someone's word for something. If the more people cite their sources, and those sources are cited, that's really how you determine whether someone's trustworthy or not. And I like to think if you come out and tell people what I just told you, it's like, don't take my word for stuff. Verify it for yourself. That exudes, I don't know, that makes me more confident with somebody. If somebody tells me right off the bat that, that you should just verify for yourself, that makes me trust somebody more, because that's the fact of the matter. That's always the fact of the matter is, Washington Post, you can't trust just because it's Washington Post. You can't trust anything unquestionably. A journalist at the Post could be correct. You just have to see if they are using good sources and if those sources are legit. It takes some work, and so that's why people, end up getting and collecting, their sources, their journalists that they trust. But ultimately, everybody can be wrong, and you just gotta operate with some basic common sense, and question things. Always question stuff. All right, let's see. But within reason too, like, anyway, like, like you get there is the danger of like going down a hole and saying, well, then you can't believe anything, because how can you? And it's true, you can't trust everything on its face, and that's a scary thought that people are not really comfortable with. Understandably, that makes life difficult if you go through and you don't trust in anybody. But when it comes to the news, just always consume it with a grain of salt. Add some salt. Okay. And then, all right, let's see. Any other super chats? I appreciate the support. I do accept tips if anyone's got a super chat, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Gonna do a quick scroll through, see if I missed any chats. Really appreciate it, Eric G. Much appreciated. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Thanks, James, 7P, Zeus, Milius, Lisa, Adam, James, Dwight, Bites, Joe, JK. Thanks, everybody, for watching. And as I wrap it up, I'll just beg one more time. If you do have a couple bucks, if you're somebody that's lucky enough to have a job or some, money you can spend, please help me make more videos on Patreon. I let you see sneak peeks so you can see videos I'm working on, like serious, like video projects that I put a lot of sweat into, my editing projects, documentary projects. What else? Oh, and when you get these sneak peeks on my Patreon, you get to give me some feedback and suggestions and influence the final product. Also, likewise, thumbs up, share, that helps too. And hell, while I got anybody here, if you got any suggestions for future videos, I take those. I am considering doing a project just clearly explaining the Assange case, specifically the data sets that the government alleges were too dangerous to publish. Because I think people don't really understand I haven't seen a good, clear presentation of these massive data sets and their importance, and why the government is saying that they're too dangerous to publish, which is obviously historic. The government has never said, actually, they have said things that have been too dangerous to publish before, but every time they say it, it's been overturned or proven wrong, but this is the first time that they're saying that they've actually are prosecuting a publisher for doing that. In the past, they would just issue a subpoena to have them stop publishing. This is the first time that they've prosecuted somebody for publishing after the fact. And so this is a really big case, and I'm rambling, but screw Google. That's a good username. Peace 7P. Thanks again, JK. And oh wow, Eric G says, "Keep up the good work. It's the first time you saw me." Whoa. Cool. Well, I hope people did see this, because I know stuff. Fucking YouTube, they promote the corporate stuff. Oh, I do have one more thing for you lucky folks who still stick around. Stuck around. I mentioned it earlier, but I'll just explain it again. We'll just end on this. So basically, the theme of today was that arguments from authority are bullshit. It's a logical fallacy. It's taught in high school, college, and yet YouTube's entire algorithm is based on this logical fallacy, which is an appeal to authority. Here, this is the definition of this logical fallacy. Quote, an argument from authority, also called an appeal to authority or argumentum adverse, I'm not even going to try that Latin, is a form of argument in which the opinion of an authority on a topic is used as evidence to support an argument. So, just because a source is authoritative, as YouTube has labeled all the corporate news channels, doesn't mean they're right. And to pretend that they are authoritative sources and correct just because you label them authoritative sources is a logical fallacy. And as long as YouTube has that in their algorithm, we're effed. We're totally fucked. And I just, that was what YouTube was supposed to be, a place where you could see an alternative view, see points of views that are not just from these people of authority who so often are stenographers for the government and corporations. And YouTube is destroying YouTube so that it is no longer YouTube, but it is AuthorityTube, because they promote authoritative sources, who they deem authoritative sources, who we have just shown, for example, are wrong a lot of the time, very often, a disturbing amount of the time. And one of the great recent examples is how they got this Wuhan lab leak theory incorrect. They misframed it as a conspiracy theory. It was a legitimate theory, a legitimate scientific hypothesis, and they smeared it as false without any evidence to support that determination of false or debunked. They just went ahead and plastered headlines everywhere that this theory was false. The fact of the matter, and let me be clear, is that there is a lack of evidence supporting either theory of where this coronavirus originated, whether it was in nature or in this lab studying coronavirus, which happened to be 2 miles away from where coronavirus from this Wuhan seafood market, which everyone says or said was the source of the virus. And my brain's a little fried now. I am an introvert who usually spends his time video editing, and this is what happens when I talk for 2 hours on YouTube. So anyway, thanks again, everyone, for tuning in, and I'm out. Peace. Less groupthink, more you think. I need a slogan. Context matters. How about that? Less groupthink, more you think. Let me try that out. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.